All right. I'm making another video on such short notice because I'm practically kicking myself for failing to see something which should have been obvious. If not in the next to last video I produced, like part 8 or so of the theological difficulty series. It should have been obvious in the last one I did, but I still didn't quite recognize it. I still didn't figure it out. It's an interesting argument. By itself, it seems to be a knockdown argument. But in order in order for it to be presented with its proper measure of force, I think I do need to kind of recapitulate what I talked about in the Air Force, the aircraft manual thought experiment. The difference between Catholicism and other forms of Christianity is that if Catholicism is true, then papal infallibility is true. If papal infallibility is true, then there is always this way to find the true church reliably, even if you are ignorant of first order or object level theology. Whereas if Catholicism is not true and papal infallibility is not true, if you have any other form of Christianity, the only way you will recognize it as the true form of Christianity is if you have some knowledge of object level or first order theology. You have to know something about theology, whereas if papal infallibility is true, you could believe in Catholicism because you know that all their teachings are true because of your object level or first order theological knowledge. Or you could believe that papal infallibility is true because you know that you don't have any first order theological or object level, theological knowledge, but you do know that papal infallibility is either true or it's not true, and that if it is true, then there is still a way for you to find the true church even if you don't have first order or object level theological knowledge. And this is analogous to a situation where people are each trying to build a strange alien aircraft out of a DIY kit that comes with a set of instructions, but the instructions are really hard to understand and the aircraft is really strange. Unlike assembling IKEA furniture or something, it's not like if you're doing it wrong, it'll feel like you're doing it wrong. There are many ways that this aircraft can seem to have been intended to be constructed. There are many ways that the pieces can snap together. The manual is hard to understand. In the manual, you could find support for one version of the aircraft being the right way to build it or another. But in the end, there is only one right way to build the aircraft. It is like a self-flying aircraft. If you do not fly it right, if you do not build it the right way, the one right way, which has very little margin for error, practically none, then it will not fly safely. But at the end of this challenge, your aircraft must be flight worthy enough that you can fly it safely to its destination, or rather it can fly you safely to the destination that you are traveling to. And so now what's going on is that, in this situation, there's like 100 people. You're one of them. But 10 of these people are different from the rest. 9 of them are experts in aeronautics, and they claim you should make your aircraft like theirs based on what they know, based on their expertise. The only issue is that they all disagree with each other. So, at least 8 of these 9 people have to be wrong, and possibly they're all wrong. And if one of them is right, the only way you could find out is basically by leaning on your own sort of first order or object level knowledge of the manual. Whereas all that you really have is a kind of second order or meta level knowledge that you don't know anything that the manual is trying to communicate. You don't understand any of it. So it's a problem. The experts are not really furnishing a handy solution to this situation. Now there is another person, the 10th sort of expert or quasi-expert is not really an expert. He's just somebody who's rumored to have a special relationship with the inventor of the aircraft, who is watching the proceedings from sort of outside the warehouse where this is all happening. And the inventor, according to the rumor, is going to sort of buzz or page this 10th man every time the 10th man makes his aircraft wrong in any way. Like anytime he builds it wrong in some particular respect, he's going to get an error message that only he can detect. And he's going to keep getting that message until he fixes the mistake. So in theory, only one of these people is necessarily bound to produce an aircraft that is totally safe. But he is only bound to do it if the rumor is true, and it's just a rumor, so you don't really know if it's true or not. So now the question is basically, what should you do? Should you act as if the rumor is true? Should you follow one of the 9 experts? Should you just try to DIY it totally on your own and not follow anyone? In this scenario, the 10th man and the rumor being true corresponds to the Catholic Church and papal infallibility being true. There's a certain way that if you bet on the rumor being true, it's like you're betting against your and everyone else's ability to to understand the manual. And you're also betting on the willingness of the producers to have thrown you guys a lifeline, despite the fact that it is really hard for everyone to understand the manual. And so, because Catholicism is the only form of Christianity on which some brainless way of finding the true church exists, you just always submit to your highest ecclesial superior in moments of schism or division. Even if you don't understand what they're dividing over or who's correct, you can always, if papal infallibility is true, you can always theoretically be in the correct church by submitting to your ultimate ecclesial superior. So in that sense, the 10th person corresponds to Catholicism. And these 9 other experts correspond to the other streams of tradition that are established: Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, Reformed theology, dispensationalist theology, every kind of Protestantism. I mean, it's more than 9, but depending on how granular you want to be, maybe it's fewer, because if you count all Protestants as one, then it's only 3 experts. But, the problem remains, because you don't know which one to choose, except, by being rather good at understanding the manual yourself, which the pity of it is that you are not. Now, you could even just assume that you know better than everybody else, or you could assume that the show producers are not willing to offer you any help, in which case maybe you would mistrust all of the supposed experts. Or maybe, which is almost like atheism, you would assume there's no correct way to build this aircraft, and this is just a pointless exercise. Something like that. There's different, things you can do here. And, suppose that you tell your friend who's in the competition with you, well, I'm going to follow the 10th man, and assume that the rumor is true, because if it's not true, then it's really as if the producers expected us to be able to figure this manual out on our own, and or like didn't want us to succeed in this challenge. But I do believe they want us to succeed in this challenge. And I know that I can't make heads or tails of the manual, and I'm pretty sure nobody else can either. So I think this is the lifeline that they've given us, because the other experts, it's not going to work. And then if your friend says, well, that would be a nice thing to believe if it were true, but unfortunately the only way you know if he's telling the truth or if the rumor is true is if you actually can verify everything he's doing in the manual on your own. But that's not true, because if you know that the producers are willing for you to do this challenge despite your almost total inability to understand the contents of the manual, then you can follow this 10th man and believe the rumor is true, not because you claim to understand the manual, but precisely because you claim to not, or know that you don't. Okay, so that one doesn't really work. The other thing that the person could say is, well, you know, the only way it would be nice to believe that they gave us this person, that the rumor is true, that we could all follow, even though we don't understand the manual. But it's not necessarily true, because it assumes that they're willing for us to overcome this challenge. And we can't necessarily make that assumption. The issue, though, is that if you don't make that assumption and you admit that you're almost totally clueless as to how to understand this manual, then it's not like the rumor being false has any implication for action. You're so clueless that you might as well build it anyway. I mean, you could guess at random that one of the experts has to be right and just eeny, meeny, miny, mo. But, you know, why assume that any of the experts is right? Again, it's assuming that the producers were willing to throw you guys some kind of lifeline. Unless you make that assumption, you have functionally no chance of doing this, or even if you have some remote chance of doing it correctly, you know, by chance, still this business is so difficult that there's functionally no relationship between the amount of effort you put into the endeavor and the accuracy of your resultant guess. It's so counterintuitive that you might as well just guess. There's no relationship between, you know, how much brain power you put into this and the accuracy of your resultant outcome. It's kind of like if you ask your kids to do your taxes, it doesn't matter how hard they work at it, they will just never get it, right? If they're like little kids, like 2 or 3 year olds or something, right? So this is the situation. If it is not the case that they're willing to help you, there's not really anything you can do. But the other thing is this, that although you don't know if the rumor is true, you also don't know if it's not true. The only way you would know if it wasn't true is if you somehow knew the manual well enough to know that the rumored man was building his aircraft wrong. But you don't have that. And another thing, though, that your friend could say is, well, you know what, at the end, I don't think they're going to make us fly this thing. I think that nobody's going to fly it. Nobody's going to build it right, but it doesn't matter. We're all going to get graded on a curve, and whoever's aircraft is closest to the correct way it's supposed to be built, you know, will sort of be the winner of the competition. And I'm just trying to be as close as possible. Well, again, if you're totally clueless about what the manual is saying, how can you rule out the possibility that the rumored man is building his aircraft closest to the way it should look? There's no way to tell from looking at anyone's aircraft, you know, which one is more accurate than another. And everyone's aircraft is different. But people do seem and you know, you can't just rely on some subjective sense of certainty and everything snapping together to tell you that you're doing it the right way, because everyone seems very certain that they're doing it the right way, to the point of, like violence and blows and shouting. The problem is there's no agreement. And so there's a certain way where the only way you would rule out the rumor being true is if you had like a specific technical knowledge that it was false. You can see this in another way where if your friend says, well, I don't think it's going to be, we're going to be asked to fly it, nor do I think it's going to be graded on a curve. I think it's going to be pass-fail. I think that in the end, everyone who builds their aircraft with just these 3 basic features is going to get a passing grade. So long as it has, let's say, like the wing, this dorsal wing over here, and then like some kind of ventral flap over here, and then some kind of propeller on the top, like middle or something. I don't know. It's like saying that anybody who believes in the Trinity, divino-human Christology, and the biblical inspiration of at least the 66 books of the Protestant canon is good enough, such that, it truly doesn't make a difference if you're more accurate beyond that. And that, again, is a technical claim. It's a technical claim, or I should put it like this. There's no reason to believe that following the rumored man would not let you end up with an aircraft that had these extremely general features that basically everyone's aircraft has. If it's the case that his aircraft indeed does have these extremely general features that everyone else's aircraft practically does, and we assume that the 10th man's aircraft does indeed possess these general features, then there's no actual downside to still assuming that the rumor is true, unless one is making a technical claim, again, that it's going to be pass-fail, but if you build it like the rumored man's, you're going to fail. Again, some knowledge of the manual is actually required in order for this claim to go through. Otherwise, if we are totally ignorant, there is no reason not to build your aircraft according to the rumored man. Part of being clueless and truly clueless is, or, here's another thing that could happen is your friend could say, well, look, there's 10 experts and the rumored man is only one of them. If we assume that the producers are throwing us a lifeline, it could be any of these experts. And matter of fact, it's only a 1/10 chance that the rumored man is right. I should bet on any of the other 9 except the rumored man. That way, I have a better chance or something like that. But if you are assuming that the producers are doing something in this show in order to increase your chances of winning, and they can do whatever they want, it sort of stands to reason that if they're intervening in order to let you win, bring about the outcome of your succeeding, that they would intervene in a way that is more effective rather than less effective. Because if they just make the lifeline be one of these 10 men, but it's one of the experts, and you would only figure it out if you just guess right, or if you happen to be super brilliant and you do figure out the manual, which no one actually can. And see, what this corresponds to is that God is not a thing that you can just figure out from pure reason. In order to understand him, we are totally at the mercy of his own sovereign self-disclosure. And that means, unless it is to take the form of just like me having some immediate relationality with God where I know that I'm right about whatever theological claim I'm making because my sense of inner knowing is just that intense. And I somehow know that my sense of inner knowing is more intense than that of the other guy who's making a different theological claim. If it's not going to devolve into something hopelessly subjective like that, which prevents us from even speaking of there being sort of like this one objective correct anything, then there has to be like this public authority. And it has to be understood that without there being such a public authority that you can rest on, nobody can figure out purely from their own reason. And so so accordingly in this thought experiment, nobody's actually smart enough to figure out the manual on their own. The only hope would be, I guess you could guess right just by sheer chance. It's extremely unlikely, but you could. But no one's going to skill it. No one's going to do it based on skill. It's either going to be sheer dumb luck, or it's going to be because you guessed right, on one of those 10, and it is the case that one of those 10 would let you build the aircraft correctly if you pattern your aircraft after theirs. The thing is, based on the rationale that your friend offers for following one of the 9, there's actually still no reason not to follow the 10th man. And in fact, based on that kind of rationale, you should still follow the 10th man, because then the intervention of the producers is maximally efficacious. They can do anything they want to maximize your chances of success theoretically. So as long as you're assuming that they're intervening for the purposes of maximizing your chances of success in this challenge, it makes the most sense based on that rationale to believe that the rumor is true. Let me see. So I think we can see from this that I was saying that part of being totally clueless is like you have all these different ways you could go, and you have no principled basis for selecting one of them rather than another. It's like if you were a blind dart thrower who's trying to hit a dartboard in a circular room, and it's very small, and you're blindfolded, and you don't know if you're facing the dartboard or not. You actually don't even technically know if you're going to miss. You know you're probably going to, but you don't know that you will for sure. The only thing you really know is that you're blind. Any one direction you could turn does not offer any clear benefit over any other direction. In some sense, the problem is that, because the likelihood of each possible direction is the same, it's equally low, but it's the same. Nevertheless, you don't know which direction to go. Similarly, if you're totally clueless about the manual, maybe we would even say it's written in an alien language or something. I don't know. We know that you can't figure it out totally on your own. You know that you could only figure it out by leaning on an authority. Well, since any way is as good as any other, assuming that the producers aren't trying to help you, any way is still as good as any other. So there's no downside to choosing the way of the rumored man. So what you really see is that no matter what the parameters of the experiment are, is it pass fail? Is it graded on a curve? Is it you really have to build it that one right way? Is it that the producers are willing to help you? Is it that they are not? It doesn't matter. There's always at least no downside to patterning your aircraft after the rumored man, and there is significant conceivable upside. And this is the same as papal infallibility, because papal infallibility, just in the abstract, is just this thing that would be really great if it was true. And if we assume that God is intervening providentially in church affairs to assist us in uncovering the truth about God, it makes sense to assume that he would intervene in a way that produces maximum effect or maximum success. Like he wouldn't just make it so that, well, in the schismatic future, one of the 6 different options would be right, because then people would at best have only like a 16-17% chance of being right. Rather, it makes more sense to assume that he would make it so that it was the same church that keeps being right, and it's also this church that has some kind of visible, obvious marker of authority, which is, how to put it, even if you're Eastern Orthodox and you never believe that the Pope had anything like universal jurisdiction or papal infallibility, it doesn't matter. because he was always for you, even in some purely, if only in some purely nominal sense, and only until the point where he sort of fell off by introducing heresy into his teaching. Still before that, he was the head of the church. So, there's this way that if you're going to go just purely by authority and not try to figure it out for yourself, it is, Catholicism is what you would choose. Let me see. So, if papal infallibility were true, it would be a great thing, because it would mean that nobody has to rely on their own object level knowledge of theology, which is admittedly quite confusing because there's a lot of disagreement on it, even among the very smartest theologians and pastors and priests and what have you. There's a lot of disagreement on it. It also seems like to get object level knowledge, you need to study all these languages and put in all these hours, etc. And there's this regrettable thing where if it does depend on your own knowledge, no matter how much you would like to submit to some other non-Catholic authority, you can really only tell they're an authority to the extent that you yourself know anything about theology. It's actually resting on your own expertise implicitly, which again, like I said, you could rest your faith in Catholicism on the same thing, on your own expertise. And then whenever the Pope says something next month that rubs you the wrong way, you probably go and be a sede vacantist. But I mean, you could do it that way, or you can rest it on the fact that you know nothing. But you know that if papal infallibility is true, then there's hope for you, despite the fact that you know nothing, assuming that God is willing to intervene in a way that assists us in finding the truth about him, which, as long as we're making that assumption, papal infallibility makes the most sense to assume. Just if that's the only reason for believing in some kind of reliable external authority, is just that one abstract reason, we should be assuming papal infallibility. Really, the only time we would not assume it is if we happen to find on sort of technical or theological grounds that there's a mistake in Catholicism, in the doctrine itself somewhere, or some other position is totally right and Catholicism is wrong on something, etc. A priori, on paper, papal infallibility has everything going for it. In the same way that it makes sense to act as if the rumor is true, assuming that you don't know anything about the manual that you're reading. Assuming that you are totally blind on theological matters, without an external reliable guide. You should assume there's no downside to acting as if there is a reliable external guide, but there is potential upside. And if you're going to just all you know is that you know nothing, and your only hope is if there's some reliable external guide, whatever the chance of that actually is, then you're gonna choose the Pope unless you believe you actually have these technical grounds to show why it's not the case. And so now the question is, do you have first order object level knowledge of theology? Does anyone have independent first order object level knowledge of the manual? This is the question. So, I don't even really know yet what this would correspond to in the analogy, but it seems to me that if we're barring the kind of facile sort of immediate relationality, where God doesn't relate to us through a public authority that everyone can turn and point to, seems like the only other option is you're relying on your skill in like this academic way. And, that skill is going to be, your knowledge of theology is going to be held to rest on some source of authority, not necessarily the Pope, but some like the seven councils or just the Bible, or, the seven councils plus scripture, whatever, or plus the bishop of the College of Bishops in your denomination, like Anglicanism or something, or Eastern Orthodoxy. It's relying on these, And now the question is, okay, so you're claiming to have first order or object level knowledge. Let's keep it simple, just because you're reading the Bible the right way. Let's assume that you are reading the Bible in a way that would be correct if the Bible were inspired. How do you know that the Bible is inspired? It is received by the people with the correct theology, or it is the one that was put together by the people who have the right theology. How do you know that they have the right theology? Well, it's because your way of reading the Bible, which is the way that would be valid if the Bible was indeed inspired, tells you that this is correct theology. But it's only correct if the Bible is inspired, and the Bible is you can only know that the Bible is inspired if your theology is correct. So it's circular. Where it's circular like this, it's not knowledge. It's begging the question. It's totally circular. So you don't have first order or object level knowledge in that case. It's the same thing with Eastern Orthodoxy and the councils. Like, which councils are the right councils, right? Which are truly ecumenical or orthodox councils? Well, they're the ones that are received by the right people. Okay? How do we know who the right people are? Well, they're the ones who are receiving the ecumenical councils, the real ones. It's like, okay, it's circular. For Protestants or biblical Unitarians or Jehovah's Witnesses or anyone, Trinitarian Protestants or biblical Unitarians or Jehovah's Witnesses, to ground the canon, to ground their theological knowledge in some kind of authority, like let's say the Bible. And, how do you know that these books are indeed inspired? How do you know they have anything to them? Not even looking at the question of, how do you know it's these all books and not possibly that one and not this one? Like, not even getting into that, but how do you know that like any of these books at all are inspired? It's like, well, the people who say they are trustworthy. Why are they trustworthy? Because they have the right theology. Okay, how do I know they have the right theology? Well, because this is the way, this theology is what the Bible says is correct. And how do I know that what the Bible says is correct? Because it's inspired. And how do I know it's inspired? Because the people who have the right theology say it is. Something like this. Basically, everyone's going to do some form of that. Even if you grant, like the Jehovah's Witnesses or biblical Unitarians premises that they are reading the Bible in the right way, and that, like, say, the earliest authorities on whom they are appealing, for the canon or something like that, agreed with them. Even if you grant those things, it's still only circular, which means that it's not knowledge. And if you don't have first order or object level knowledge, you have no real grounds to dismiss papal infallibility. You have no good reason not to assume that it is true. Let me pause. You can say, well, I'm going off track because if the Bible is not inspired, Catholicism is false too. That's kind of incidental. I know that Protestants and Catholics both affirm that the Bible is inspired, but they do so for different reasons. What I'm getting at are the inherent difficulties of having to say that finding the true church depends on your own object level or first order knowledge of theology, not just your knowledge that you don't know any concrete or specific theology. See, because when you do that, an authority only has authority, to the extent that you can prop them up with your own knowledge. But if God is not a thing, but a someone that you relate to through this public authority, then you can only know about him, based on there being some kind of external authority. But you will just never know who that is in a non-circular way, which is to say you will never know it. if it has to rest on your first order or object level theology. Now, someone could say, well, the way I'm going about this is circular too. I'm wondering if that's true. My starting point is basically this. Either papal infallibility is true or it's not true. That seems safe. If it's true, there's a way to find the true church reliably that doesn't require object level or first order knowledge of theology. I think that's also safe to say. But if it is not true, then there is no way to find it reliably unless you have those things. Now, I think I've shown actually that you can't actually have knowledge if knowledge requires some kind of non-circular basis for establishing the validity of the source of your supposed knowledge. So everyone is in fact ignorant. Now, papal infallibility is only true if God wants it to be true, and it's not every good thing that God can do that he does do. But if he's not helping us, we might as well just do any random thing because we have no chance on our own. So there's no reason to not assume Catholicism is true. And in fact, we can never know that he's not willing to help us. So there's always going to be like sort of a non-zero, however small we want to say it is, chance that he is helping us. And if he is helping us, we should always assume that that means papal infallibility is most likely, unless we have some specific technical knowledge to tell us that papal infallibility is not correct on a posteriori or technical grounds, which, again, we don't, because we don't have any kind of non-circular knowledge. And so, let me see. Basically, if God is not helping us, there's like, you're not even guaranteed to be wrong. It's just he's not helping you. So you are just going to do, you're just going to do something. You're going to guess something and just hope that you have this random but minuscule chance that you are correct. But at that point, if it's truly random and you truly don't know what you're doing, which I don't think you do, there's no downside to betting that Catholicism is true. And indeed, it makes sense insofar as you can never rule out papal infallibility or that God is wanting to help you. And so in that sense, there's an upside to acting as if papal infallibility is true, because you get whatever sort of original, equal, minuscule, random chance that you always have of being right by chance, whatever direction you go or whatever theological position you take, plus the non-zero chance that God wants to help us, which in the abstract, just by itself as a datum, should incline us most strongly toward papal infallibility. Because as long as we assume God is intervening for a certain purpose, we may as well assume, or it makes more sense to assume, that he is wholly successful in that purpose rather than only partially successful, just in the abstract, all else equal. But that's all we have, unless we claim to have first order, theological or object level theological knowledge. But if the only way you can have that is circular, I'm not sure that ever even counts as knowledge. And I'm sort of kicking myself for not having realized that or touched on that in my presentation earlier today about biblical Unitarians and just the canon, and whether we can establish the canon apart from sort of Catholic authority. And I, as far as I can tell right now, perhaps I made a mistake in my reasoning. I don't see that one ever can. Not if knowledge cannot be circular. Now, like I touched on this in previous conversations as well. There's some people that sort of bite the bullet, or not even bite the bullet, but like Jay Dyer is a fan of presuppositional apologetics, and I sort of get why, because I feel like there is going to be the sense in which every epistemic perspective is sort of ultimately circular. But see, now I'm wondering if and this is sort of influenced by Chris Langan, whose views you don't have to share. I don't share them because I'm Catholic, but I think he's a very interesting and brilliant philosopher. He talked about like the kind of the epistemic perspective, let's say, that's associated with the ultimate reality. And I think if there's a circularity to that, it's probably the circularity of like no circularity. It's circular logic to assume that you can't have circular logic. And so it's a curious kind of paradox. Like if I say everything needs to have a reason, and you say, and because of the principle of sufficient reason, basically, and you say, well, how do I know the principle of sufficient reason is true? If you ask that, you are also assuming the principle of sufficient reason, because in asking what's the reason for it, you're assuming that things must have reasons. And I feel like it's similar with respect to a kind of circularity of no circularity. It is the principle of sufficient reason assuming itself. And I think that to the extent that my position is circular, I think it's really only circular in the sense of saying no circles. And it's like, how do you know that there shouldn't be any circles? Because circles lead to problems. Okay, and how do we know that? I wonder whether I myself am not relying on some kind of circular logic to establish that circular logic is not right. I'm assuming logic in order to conclude logic or something like that. And so I think that is what I'm doing, but I think that's like the most valid move you can make. At a minimum, I think my perspective is more sort of comprehensive in its explanatory power. Jay Dyer says that ultimately everyone's circular. The question is just who is more sort of self-consistent. But there's no non-circular way to assess self-consistency. That's the problem. So he can have the sense that, things snap together for me when I do theology the Eastern Orthodox way. But it's not everyone who does it the Eastern Orthodox way that has the sense that things snap together, even if they participate in the same church life. Some of them become persuaded, for example, that the filioque is true, like Gideon Lazar, like Ben Bollinger, like the YouTuber who calls himself the Cathodox. And so they go off elsewhere. Or that maybe they think Protestantism is true. There's other examples of that. Similarly, there's people that are not Eastern Orthodox who do have the subjective sense of things snapping together. Those are like Dominican monks studying Thomist theology. Those are like dispensationalist guys. Those are Reform guys. They'll all say like, it never made sense to me until I looked at it this way. And now that I looked at it this way, what was dark before now makes more and more sense. And I know the theology is, I know that this approach is correct because the theology is right or feels right. And I know the theology is right because I know that this approach is correct. Like some attempt at a virtuous circle, but it's really unfortunately not trading on anything more than some subjective sense of things feeling right. And how can you assess that your subjective sense is somehow more veridical than someone else's? In principle, you don't even have access to their subjective feelings or whatever. So this is an issue. But my position, which is that theology is so hard that it's not always going to feel like you're doing it wrong when you are in fact doing it wrong. It's not always going to feel hard when it should. That does explain this sort of double dissociation that we see in the data, where not everybody who, just to use Eastern Orthodox as an example, participates in that church life does sort of catch the phronema and feel as if everything makes sense. And conversely, there are people who are not in the Eastern Orthodox Church who do have the sense of everything making sense and like, I'm definitely finally on the right track. And I would just say that that's because theology is real hard. All else equal, the system that is so hard that it doesn't always even feel hard when it should, or you don't always know that you're doing it wrong when you are in fact wrong. It doesn't feel like you're doing it wrong even though you are. All else equal, that system is harder than the one where maybe you don't know what to do, but at least when you're doing it wrong, you feel like you're doing it wrong. Like I know I'm putting this IKEA furniture together wrong in some way. It's not snapping together. Theology doesn't appear to be even, as it appears to be even more difficult than that. And my position can account for that. If all you can really say at the end of the day is, well, your position is going to be circular, but it should afford you some sense of things snapping together. Unfortunately, that does not afford a principled basis for choosing among different views, because there are different equally circular views in which people sense things snapping together. But I'm not aware of another view where, based on all the reasons why I'm saying you should choose my view, you could choose a different view. I'm just not aware of one. So, principle of sufficient reason, you have to have a reason for selecting, one of those positions out of another. Put another way, it's not as if circularity is by itself a virtue. It's more like a necessary evil. We all recognize that ordinarily circularity is not good. If someone makes a circular argument for a position that we don't agree with, we call it a bad argument. And I think there has to be some kind of criterion for sorting among, if every epistemic perspective is ultimately circular, that wouldn't obviate the need for some criterion for selecting among them. Because otherwise, just all by itself, circularity is not a virtue. And there has to be some grounds for choosing among them. And if that sort of explanatory comprehensiveness that gives you a principled basis to choose your view rather than another is not your criterion, I would wonder what the criterion is. Because again, there's no actual principled basis to choose Dyer's view from another view when all it's really saying at the end of the day is that it should offer the sense of things snapping together. It's like, no, this stuff really is right. Well, how do you know? Because it feels like it makes sense. Is that you're not saying it does make sense with respect to some kind of absolute standard because it's circular. It's more like it feels like it makes sense, but there's other ones that feel like they make sense too. Anyway, so goodness. I hope that I covered everything there. I think that's really it, I had the thought earlier today while I was driving, and I thought about how in my biblical Unitarianism video, I was all about like how, well, the early church fathers, if you rely on them for their discernment, they held different doctrines than you, so how can you do that? It was all very sort of empirical or a posteriori. When it came to the Trinitarian Protestants, I said, well, theirs just seems circular to me. Like they know the Bible is right because it was the book that was received / compiled by the people who had correct theology. And they know that the theology of those people is correct based on the Bible. So it's circular, the way that Eastern Orthodoxy is circular. Who has the right counsels? The people of God. How do you know who the people of God are? Because they'll have the right counsels. It's circular at best. So you don't even need to go challenging Jehovah's Witnesses or biblical Unitarians on the basis of that they're reading the Bible the wrong way, or they believe incorrect things about the church fathers. Because even if you grant all that, I think in the best case, their claims to knowledge are viciously circular, and as such are no. They do not represent knowledge at all, and without knowledge, you can't you can't rightly eliminate papal infallibility. Without some kind of technical reason to disfavor it, you should favor it in the abstract. I do recognize that the Catholic position again affirms, that at least those 66 books are inspired. But I don't think that it's a problem for me to say that the non-Catholic side has no non-circular basis for viewing those books as inspired, and hence no real valid basis for viewing those books as inspired, whereas the Catholic position does. Maybe it is, circular at some level. Again, my reasoning is papal infallibility is either true or it's not true. If it's true, then you can do this even though you're theologically ignorant. And if it's not true, then you can't do it reliably, at least, if you are theologically ignorant. And so, but the thing is, if you are theologically ignorant, then you don't even know if papal infallibility is not true, essentially. And or how to put it, if you assume rather that God's not helping, or you assume that he's not necessarily helping, you still don't know that papal infallibility is not true because you're theologically blind. You would only know if it wasn't true if you had theological object level knowledge that was valid and not circular. Whereas if papal infallibility is true, there's a way to do this, even if you are theologically ignorant, and it makes sense to assume this, whether or not it turns out that you need to be right at a high level of theological specificity or a low one. And it makes sense to do this whether or not we assume it's very likely that God is helping us, or not necessarily likely, but still a non-zero chance, because you can never totally eliminate it. It's just sort of game theoretically, as it were. It's a dominant strategy, unless you have some first order object level knowledge to rule it out. And so that is I don't know what you would call this argument. I've been talking about disjunctive arguments from theological difficulty. I don't know what I would call this. In some way, I would call it maybe an argument from authority. Because Catholicism is the only really principled way to rest it on authority. And if you can't rest it on authority in a principled way, or all the way, you can't rest it on authority at all, it turns out. And so, yeah, I guess maybe this would be my sort of argument from Catholic authority. It says you shouldn't rely on circular arguments. If there's a way to do this that lets you obviate, having to use this perfectly circular approach, then you should do it that other way. Now, is that in some way sort of circularly assuming its own conclusion? Premise, it's concluding that circular arguments are invalid, but only because it assumes that circular arguments are invalid. It's concluding you have to do things logically because it's assuming that you have to do things logically. I don't know, maybe, but I think that has to be more valid than the alternative. Like, at that point, if this is the gripe, then you're griping with rationality itself or something. I have to think about this more, but I just felt like kicking myself today after I realized all this later, and I just wanted to put out a video, and maybe later on I'll be more formal with it and do slides or whatever. Yeah, maybe I'll call it, I don't even know what to call it yet, argument from authority, whatever. Hopefully this was useful for you guys. For all my viewers, I do pray, and I also ask that you pray for me. Thank you for your time.